By the 15th century, the Ottoman Empire's control over the Balkan and Black Sea slave trades pushed Spain and Portugal to turn their attention to Africa. Initially, slaves were acquired from Arab traders via the trans-Saharan routes, but as Portuguese outposts were established along the West African coast, direct trade with Africa grew. This development fueled the rapid expansion of the Atlantic slave trade, which intensified following the discovery of the Americas in 1492. In the 15th century, Europeans began establishing a coastal slave trade, which expanded in the 16th century and continued through the 19th century. The majority of those enslaved and transported via the Transatlantic Slave Trade were from Central and West Africa. They were typically sold to European slave traders by African traders, though some were captured directly in coastal raids. European traders would gather the enslaved in forts along the African coastal ports, such as Benguela, Elmina, and Boni in West Africa, before transporting them to the Americas. While some Portuguese and other Europeans conducted raids, most slaves were purchased from local African or African-European intermediaries. Despite their involvement, many European slave traders avoided participating in slave raids because of the high mortality rates due to diseases like malaria, dysentery, and yellow fever. These diseases plagued Europeans in sub-Saharan Africa, leading to the region being known as the white man's grave. The first wave of European colonization, led by Spain and Portugal, primarily involved conquests and exploration in the Americas, but also included the establishment of trading posts in Africa, especially for the burgeoning slave trade. Spain and Portugal's reliance on enslaved labor in the New World became a highly profitable venture, fueling the expansion of their empires. In the Middle Ages, religion and not race was a determining factor for who was considered to be a legitimate target of slavery. While Christians did not enslave Christians, and Muslims did not enslave Muslims, both allowed the enslavement of people they regarded to be heretics or insufficiently correct in their religion, which allowed Catholic Christians to enslave Orthodox Christians, and Sunni Muslims to enslave Shia Muslims. Similarly, both Christians and Muslims approved of enslaving pagans who came to be a preferred and comparatively profitable target of the slave trade in the Middle Ages. Spain and Portugal were provided with non-Catholic slaves from Eastern Europe via the Balkan slave trade and the Black Sea slave trade. Religious zeal also played a large role in Spanish and Portuguese overseas activities. While the Pope wielded significant political influence, demonstrated by his ability to declare entire continents open for colonization by specific monarchs, the Church also sent missionaries to convert the indigenous peoples of other continents to the Catholic faith. Thus, in the year 1455, Papal Bull Romanus Pontifex granted the Portuguese all lands behind Cape Bojador and allowed them to reduce pagans and other enemies of Christ to perpetual slavery. Later in the year 1481, Papal Bull Aeterni Regis granted all lands south of the Canary Islands to Portugal. In 1493, Pope Alexander VI issued a papal bull called Inter Caetera, which gave Spain and Portugal rights to claim and colonize all non-Christian lands in the Americas and enslave Native Americans and Africans. Inter Caetera also settled a dispute between Portugal and Spain over those lands. The declaration included a north-south divide 100 leagues west of the Cape Verde Islands and gave the Spanish crown exclusive rights to travel and trade west of that line. In 1494, the Pope ushered in the Treaty of Tordesillas, granting Spain and Portugal two separate parts of the world. Due to this treaty, Portugal had the monopoly on acquiring the slaves from Africa. However, Spain, like Portugal, needed the labor force to pursue their personal economic gains, and this gave Portugal an increased revenue stream. African slaves were sold to the Spanish colonies through an internal reform known as the Asiento, which gave the right by the Spanish crown for acquiring African slaves from the Portuguese traders. The curse of Ham was also used by European Christians as a justification to enslave Africans. In Portugal and Spain, people had been enslaved because of their religious identity, and race had not been a developed factor for enslaving people. Nonetheless, by the 15th century, Europeans used both race and religion as a justification to enslave sub-Saharan Africans. The Treaty of Alcacuvas in 1479 provided traders the right to supply Spaniards with Africans. In the 15th century, the Iberian Peninsula saw a rise in the number of enslaved Africans from Senegal. As their population grew, Europeans introduced new terms that began to link slavery with skin color, such as the word Negro, meaning black. Spain and Portugal sought the utilization of foreign and indigenous peoples during post-colonial contact with the New World. The Portuguese and Spanish use of slavery in Latin America was seen as a lucrative business, which ultimately led to internal and external development in gaining economic influence at any cost. The economic pursuits of the Spanish and Portuguese empires ushered in the era of the Atlantic slave trade. As labor shortages worsened in Spanish and Portuguese colonies due to the devastating impact of European diseases and forced labor on the indigenous population, enslaved Africans were viewed primarily as a business solution. These slaves were forced into agricultural and mining work in regions under Spanish control, such as Mexico, Peru, and large parts of Central America, where slave labor became integral to mining operations. In the 15th century, Portugal shifted its attention to the latter economic endeavor. Their ships sailed from the borders of the Sahara Desert to the entirety of the West African coast, and slaves were only made available by certain conditions. The most notable condition was bartering items that the leaders wanted and were interested in. Items such as bread, coal, precious stones, and firearms were provided in exchange for slaves. Furthermore, local tribal leaders did not simply give up their own people for the aforementioned commodities, but rather through intertribal wars, debts, and civil crime offenders. In terms of the treatment of slaves, Portuguese external policies on the acquisition of slaves depict a malicious attempt to obtaining economic wealth. Nearly 3,600 slaves a year were traded by a single trader. This latter statement illuminates that traders tried to get as many slaves as they could in the shortest amount of time. Consequently, this led to the deaths of thousands of African peoples. Slaves were often branded with a mark upon their skin to identify either the ship they arrived on or the company that purchased them. In addition, the slaves were seen as a potentially economic utility. Therefore, they were often equated to cattle when moved about. Many African people died in large numbers in order to meet the demand for Spanish and Portuguese labor requirements. Both the Christian kingdoms of Spain and Portugal share a similar history in regards to the treatment of slaves in their colonies. As time progressed and new generations of slaves lived under imperial rule, Spanish and Portuguese internal reforms dealt with African slaves in areas such as the purchasing and selling of slaves, legal ownership, succession upon death of owner, the rights of slaves to buy their liberty, and penalties to those who ran away. There was a constant, strict social control amongst the slave population. Nevertheless, the goal was to create and sustain a labor force that would yield maximum economic output. The lucrative business the Portuguese sought on the West African coast ushered in an era in which human labor, at any cost, was used for the extraction of wealth. A common assumption by Africans who were unaware of the true purpose of the Atlantic slave trade was that the Europeans were cannibals who planned on cooking and eating their captives. This rumor was a common source of significant distress for enslaved Africans. Over 12 million people were forcibly taken onto European slave ships from African ports. Countless others perished on the journey to the coastal trading stations that supplied these ships. African victims of the transatlantic slave trade endured the loss of their communities, cultures, and lives, while African coastal traders who allied with Europeans gained power, prestige, and wealth by receiving goods and weapons in exchange for captives. European powers established treaties with African coastal leaders enabling them to set up fortified trading posts in strategic areas. These strongholds, especially on the Gold Coast, influenced local demographics, trade routes, and settlement patterns. The Portuguese, Dutch, and British built forts, often called castles, to symbolize their power and wealth, using cannons to guard against rival European traders. However, while Europeans sought monopolies over the coastal slave trade, African leaders played competing European traders against each other, securing the best deals for their captives. The system of slave trade relied heavily on intermediaries, with captives held in factories or trading posts near the coast before being shipped to the New World. These factories became hubs of complex interactions between Europeans and Africans, creating new languages, cultures, and mixed communities. Pidgin languages developed from this exchange, blending African and European words to facilitate communication and trade. These evolving languages facilitated trade and communication, embodying the Creole identities of their speakers. Between 12 to 13 million Africans were forcibly transported across the Atlantic over 400 years, but the number taken was far higher due to the high death toll. Millions died during capture, in transit to the coast, or in the brutal seasoning camps in the Caribbean, where newly arrived slaves were subjected to harsh conditions to break them before being sold. The transatlantic slave trade became crucial to the economies of the South Atlantic and Caribbean regions, especially for sugarcane, coffee, tobacco, and cotton production. The Portuguese were the first to transport slaves to the Americas in the 16th century, with other European nations quickly following. During the early stages, enslaved Africans in English colonies were classified as indentured servants. But by the mid-17th century, slavery became a racial caste system where African slaves and their children were deemed the legal property of their masters. The conditions during the transatlantic voyage were horrific, with many captives chained together in cramped, filthy spaces, suffering from diseases like dysentery, scurvy, and smallpox. Mortality rates were alarmingly high, and deaths only worsened the already unbearable conditions. The treatment of enslaved Africans during the Atlantic slave trade was brutal, as they were considered by slave traders to be mere cargo or goods, not human beings. Women with children and toddlers were less desirable for enslavement due to the space and maintenance they required. One infamous example is the Zong, a British slave ship that overcrowded its voyage in 1781. As malnutrition, disease, and bad weather slowed the journey and led to a water shortage, the crew chose to drown about 130 enslaved Africans to preserve resources and claim insurance for their deaths. Some enslaved individuals also chose to jump overboard in defiance. The Zong incident became a landmark in the abolitionist movement after the ship's owners were refused compensation by the insurance company, leading to a major court case. While enslaved individuals were kept alive with food and drink to preserve their value, resources were limited, and the crew was always prioritized. Punishments were frequent, and violence was used to force enslaved people into submission. In some horrific cases, such as a failed rebellion, a captain forced two enslaved men to eat the heart and liver of another who had been killed. Pregnant women who gave birth aboard these ships often saw their children killed, so the mothers could still be sold. To prevent resistance and illness, the crew forced the enslaved onto the deck for exercise, which often led to brutal beatings when they refused to comply. Enslaved Africans frequently resisted by refusing food or committing suicide, often by jumping overboard. Some ethnic groups like the crew became known for their defiance, with many committing suicide rather than enduring enslavement. Slaver crews attempted to prevent suicides by force-feeding the enslaved and using nets along the deck to stop them from jumping overboard, but resistance persisted. Captains also used extreme methods to deter escape attempts, such as exploiting the sharks that followed the ships. In one case, a captain lowered an enslaved woman into the water and pulled her out quickly, only for the crew to see that she had been partially devoured by sharks. Despite the harsh conditions, enslaved Africans often tried to escape or organize revolts. Rebellions were common, especially when ships were anchored off the African coast, but most were suppressed through extreme violence. Those who led revolts were killed and thrown overboard to the sharks as a warning to others. Ironically, insurance companies allowed slave traders to be compensated for the loss of enslaved Africans due to rebellion, disease, or punishment. The enslaved were treated as commodities with monetary value assigned to their lives, and laws enforced by European and American governments protected this dehumanizing system. Enslaved Africans vastly outnumbered the crew, so the traders used chains, manacles, guns, and severe discipline to maintain control. Routines were developed to manage the captives, including regular feedings and exercises on deck when weather permitted. However, most Africans remained shackled below deck, imprisoned in cramped conditions. Women and children had slightly more mobility, but they were vulnerable to abuse and rape by the crew. The squalid conditions aboard the ships also facilitated the spread of diseases like dysentery, killing many and leaving others in a weakened state. Despite efforts by captains and crew to control and suppress the enslaved, Africans found ways to communicate with each other. Through call and response songs and using the ship's structure as percussion, they developed a hidden system of communication that fostered solidarity and even aided in organizing revolts. This form of resistance provided a sense of identity and power in an otherwise oppressive and dehumanizing environment. Slave ships were specifically designed to prevent rebellion, but about 1 in 10 ships experienced some form of uprising. Though most revolts failed, the participants were punished severely, often by death, to discourage further resistance. While ship owners and captains profited greatly from the slave trade, the crew endured harsh conditions and low pay. Many sailors were forced to sleep on the open deck, as the space below was reserved for the enslaved. Crew mortality rates were high, with around 20% dying due to disease, punishment, or slave uprisings. For captains, high mortality rates among the crew were sometimes advantageous, as fewer sailors needed to be paid upon the ship's return. Those who survived often faced deceitful practices and were denied their wages. In total, contemporary historians estimate that between 9.4 and 12.6 million Africans reached the New World, but millions more perished before arrival. Despite the staggering human toll, the transatlantic slave trade remained a cornerstone of European colonial economic ambitions for centuries, powered by the exploitation of African lives. In the 18th century, the drive for profits in the Atlantic market economy led to innovations in ship design and the management of enslaved Africans and European crew members. Improvements in airflow on slave ships helped reduce the high mortality rates that plagued voyages in the 16th and 17th centuries. New ship designs also enabled faster travel and easier navigation along African coastal rivers, granting access to more inland slave trading posts. The enslaved were highly valuable in American markets, with mid-18th century auction prices ranging from $800 to $1,200 per person, equivalent to $32,000 to $48,000 today. To protect their human cargo ship, captains and investors sought technologies to increase the chances of survival during the Middle Passage. English ships were generally larger, while French ships were smaller. The ability to navigate rivers allowed smaller ships to reach more remote African ports, thus intensifying the impact of the slave trade on the continent. Over the 1700s, ship sizes increased slightly, but the number of enslaved individuals per ship remained constant, providing more space per person in hopes of improving survival rates. Ships were also equipped with temporary storage decks separated by latticed bulkheads to prevent mutinies. By the early 19th century, some ships even included ventilation ports to improve airflow and reduce the risk of disease, thereby minimizing financial losses. In addition to better ship design, knowledge of diseases, and the inclusion of medicines aboard ships played a role in protecting cargo. The Dutch East India Company, followed by other nations, initially recognized the benefits of having surgeons on board, but found it too expensive. Instead, ships were stocked with a variety of medicines. While this was an improvement, the absence of medical personnel still contributed to high mortality rates during the 18th century. While about 1 million enslaved Africans died during the Middle Passage, the total death toll was even higher, including those who perished during raids on the march to the coast or shortly after arriving in the Americas. The Middle Passage was part of a longer, grueling journey. Survivors were often transported again after arriving in the Americas, enduring further hardship as they were moved to plantations, mines, and homes across the New World. Many enslaved Africans, weakened by their experience aboard the ships, died soon after arrival in places like Brazil and the Caribbean.